A quiet man, an arrogant teacher, and a piano. What began as a cruel intent to humiliate him turned into a moment that silenced the classroom and shattered proud egos. You won't believe how he turned the tables, not with words, but with music. That's Solomon Soul Turner, 68, a black janitor at Crestwood Academy in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. With disheveled silver hair, thin hands pushing a trash cart down the halls, and a weathered frame, Soul was a quiet figure, unnoticed, amid the throng of wealthy students. But today, he'd make them all turn and look. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the latest stories. The gates of Crestwood Academy swung wide under the morning sun, showcasing the grandeur of one of Atlanta's most prestigious private schools. Expensive cars rolled into the lot, where students stepped out in sleek designer uniforms, carrying branded bags, exuding the confidence of those born into privilege. Laughter echoed across the granite-paved courtyard, where these entitled kids belonged as naturally as breathing. But in a shadowed corner, Soul Turner shuffled past, his worn shoes tapping lightly on the sidewalk. Ignored and unacknowledged, he didn't own a car, didn't wear a pricey suit, didn't have the polished look of the kids here. Soul gripped the trash cart's handle, hurrying past chatting cliques, hoping to avoid notice. But that was never easy. Claire Wentworth, 17, with shimmering blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, was the perfect specimen in the eyes of teachers and parents. Daughter of a powerful real estate mogul, she wasn't just beautiful, she ruled the crowd. Look at the old janitor. Claire's voice rang out as Soul crossed the courtyard. I bet he can't even afford a new broom. A friend of hers smirked. He probably begs for food at church like always. Soul bit his lip, but kept moving. He was used to the taunts. At Crestwood, everything revolved around money. Those without it were invisible. But invisibility was sometimes better than being Claire's target. And behind her stood Edward Langston, the school's music teacher, a man with a dry voice and cold eyes, who doted on his elite students, but never saw Soul as anything more than a lowly grunt. After each long shift at Crestwood Academy, he didn't head to a lavish mansion or a fancy restaurant like the students here. He walked into a rundown apartment, a few blocks away, where peeling walls and a musty smell hung in the air. The place had little: a creaky bed, a rotting wooden table, and a few dusty keepsakes. A black and white photo of his late wife Eleanor, smiling gently beside a younger him, and a small piano with broken keys he never touched. Each day, as he pushed the trash cart down halls or swept the grounds, Claire and her posse found ways to make him their entertainment. That day was no different. As Soul bent to pick up a can a student had deliberately dropped, Claire's voice cut through, sharp as a blade. Look at the old janitor. Probably thinks that broom's a magic wand. Her friends burst out laughing, one adding, I bet he's never seen anything fancier than that trash cart. Claire tilted her head, blonde hair glinting under the hallway lights, her blue eyes flashing with glee as he silently picked up the litter. Maybe he should pick up extra work at the church, she mocked. That's more his scene. He was used to the barbs. They brushed past like a cold wind, chilling but not enough to break him. At Crestwood, everything was about money, cars, clothes, status, and those without it were like air. Being overlooked was routine, but being Claire's target was another story. She didn't just want him invisible, she wanted him to feel small. Edward Langston, the school's haughty music teacher, never stepped in. He strode by, polished leather shoes, clicking on the floor, a smirk tugging at his lips, as if approving Claire's game. To Langston, Soul wasn't worth a glance. What did an old janitor have to do with the refined world of music he ruled? But Claire and Langston didn't know one thing. Soul hadn't always been this quiet man. Years ago, he'd stood on the stage of Atlanta's Blue Moon Lounge, his hands dancing over piano keys, turning jazz notes into his own story. Crowds had clapped, cheered, called his name. Now, music was a memory he'd buried, but it still simmered inside him, like a fire not fully extinguished. Sometimes, when no one noticed, Soul sneaked into the school's small chapel at night, where a dusty old piano sat. He'd sit, trembling fingers brushing the keys, playing a few notes of a long-ago tune, but he'd stop, heart pounding, at the sound of distant footsteps. He didn't want anyone to know, didn't want anyone digging up the past he'd tried to hide. At home, as night fell, he sat by the window, streetlights casting shadows on his wrinkled face. He looked at Eleanor's photo, her eyes still as gentle as ever. "Don't let anyone take your music," she'd once said, her warm voice echoing in his mind. But music had left him when she did, or so he thought. He lived to get by, worked to forget, and stayed silent to avoid attention. But Claire and her crew wouldn't let him be. Each taunt was a knife, not because it hurt, but because it reminded him of what he'd had, and what he'd lost. That day, as he left the school, late sunlight hit his worn shoes. He gripped his hands tight, walking faster than usual, trying to escape Claire's laughter still ringing from the courtyard. He didn't know that soon, everything would change. Soul hadn't always been the quiet janitor pushing a trash cart through Crestwood Academy's halls. Years back, he was a different man, a jazz pianist whose hands turned keys into living stories. In his youth, Soul had stood on the Blue Moon Lounge's stage, a small but vibrant club where dim lights bathed his face, and crowds hung on every note he played. He didn't learn music in fancy classrooms or from renowned teachers. Instead, Soul listened to Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk on a crackly old radio in a cramped boarding room, letting his hands figure out how to echo those melodies. He didn't just play piano, he lived it, made it his breath, his way of telling the world he existed. But music had drifted away from Soul, or rather, he'd drifted from it. Everything changed when Eleanor, the wife he loved more than life, passed away. It was a rainy day when she fell ill and never woke, leaving him with an emptiness no words could capture. To Soul, every note after that was a blade to the heart, recalling the nights he'd played for Eleanor in their tiny apartment, her eyes glowing with pride. He sold his grand piano, swore off the keys, and locked his passion in a dark corner of his soul. Racism helped push him off the stage too. No matter his talent, he was turned away from big venues, met with sneers from white promoters. "You're good, but no one wants to hear a guy like you." So he gave up, choosing a quiet life, janitorial work to forget it all. But music didn't let go as easily as he thought. It lived in him, smoldering like embers under ash. At Crestwood, he steered clear of the music room, where Edward Langston taught privileged kids Mozart and Beethoven on costly grand pianos. To Soul, pianos were for the rich, not him. But sometimes, when night fell and the school hushed, Soul slipped into the little chapel. There, an old piano stood alone, keys yellowed and dust-coated. He'd sit, shaky fingers touching the keys, playing a few notes of Round Midnight, a tune he'd partly written for Eleanor. The sound wasn't perfect, some keys buzzed, but to Soul, it was more beautiful than any piano at Crestwood. He played with his whole heart, letting the notes retell the pain and joy of days gone by. He had no teacher, no new sheet music, but that didn't stop Soul from learning. He borrowed old books from the public library, reading notes by his apartment's dim light, trying to recall the melodies he'd once played. He listened to old recordings on a beat-up cassette player, letting his hands rediscover the feel of yesteryear. He was afraid of memories flooding back, afraid of ridicule, afraid he wasn't the man from Blue Moon Lounge anymore. One quiet night, as Soul played in the chapel's dark corner, the gentle sound of a jazz ballad filled the empty pews. The music slipped through stained glass windows, drifting out like a whisper from a lost time. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing a slight figure. It was Malik Jones, a 16-year-old from the poor south side of town. His eyes lit up, as if hearing real music for the first time. "You play amazing," Malik blurted, his voice full of awe and admiration. Soul stood, his gaze hardening as if caught in a forbidden act. "Don't tell anyone," he said, low and firm. "Got it?" Then he turned away, leaving Malik bewildered in the chapel's dim light, questions stuck in his throat. The next morning, Crestwood Academy's music room sat in heavy silence. At its center stood a gleaming grand piano, majestic and imposing, like a witness to what was coming. Sol stood before it, his thin hands clutching the hem of his faded gray janitor's uniform. Sweat beaded on his brow. His breaths were short, ragged. They wanted him to fail, to become a laughingstock in a room full of kids who'd never had to fight for anything. Claire Wentworth stood with arms crossed, a smirk daring him. Edward Langston loomed mid-class, hands clasped, eyes glinting with smugness. The air was thick, stifling, as if the world waited for him to crumble. But then, something in Sol shifted. He sat slowly on the bench, the wood creaking under his weight. His trembling hands rested on the keys, calloused from years of pushing trash carts, now touching what he'd sworn never to touch again. Snickers rose from a few students, primed for a clumsy show. Claire whispered to a friend, "He'll probably smash the piano." But Sol heard nothing. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and in that moment, memories crashed over him like a wave. He saw himself at Blue Moon Lounge, dim lights on his youthful face, the crowd clapping as he played. He saw Eleanor, her gentle smile, as he composed for her, and he heard her voice, clear as if she were here. "Don't let anyone take your music." His fingers twitched. A single note rang out, low and soft, like a drop on still water. The class went quiet for a second, then a scoff broke the hush. "Sounds good so far," a student sneered, loud enough for all to hear. Sol opened his eyes, his hands began to move, and then Thelonious Monk's Round Midnight flooded the room. It wasn't the rigid classical Langston taught, but jazz, deep, free, raw with feeling. The first notes were gentle as a breath, then grew bold, sweeping the space, as if each key told his life's story. The laughter died. Claire, mid-lean to whisper another jab, sat up straight, blue eyes wide. Langston, still with arms crossed, frowned slightly, as if doubting what he heard. The other students, who'd giggled when Sol sat, now sat silent, mouths shut, hands still. In the corner, Malik Jones smiled, eyes shining with pride. He knew Sol could do it. Sol closed his eyes again, letting the music guide him, letting his aged fingers find the feel of days long past. The song wasn't just notes, it was soul. Each melody was a memory. Late nights at Blue Moon Lounge, crowd applause, Eleanor's loving gaze, and the times he'd been rejected, dismissed, pushed off stages for his skin. It was the pain he'd buried, the joy he'd known, the resilience he'd never claimed. The notes rose and fell, fierce yet tender, declaring he wasn't the invisible man they thought. He didn't just play the piano, he made it live, made it sing, made it shout for all he'd kept silent over the years. The room's mood shifted. Laughter vanished, replaced by utter silence, only the piano's sound echoing. Claire gripped her desk's edge, her smug smile gone, replaced by a shock she couldn't hide. Her friends, always quick to laugh with her, sat frozen, drawn into a world they hadn't expected. Langston's arms dropped, eyes narrowing, a flicker of unease crossing his ever-confident face. He'd wanted Sol to fail, had been certain this old janitor would be a joke, but what he heard wasn't clumsiness or error, it was refined, soulful music, beyond even his best students' reach. Sol didn't stop, he played faster, hands gliding over the keys with growing assurance, as if he weren't a 68-year-old in worn shoes and a janitor's shirt. He was the artist who'd once shaken rooms. He remembered nights with Eleanor by his side, her hand on his shoulder as he composed. He remembered playing in the chapel, unheard, when he thought music was his alone. But now, it wasn't a secret. It poured out, powerful, unstoppable, a wave washing away every taunt in that room. When the final note sounded, soft and lingering, fading like a breeze, the class stayed silent. No one spoke, no one moved, as if still grasping what had happened. Sol opened his eyes, looked at the keys, his breath still quick, but his heart no longer racing with fear. He'd done it. He'd let music speak for him. And in that moment, he knew everything had changed. A timid clap came from the corner. Malik, beaming. Then another. Then the room erupted in applause. Not pity, but recognition of what they'd heard. Langston stood still, hands at his sides, trying to stay composed, but his eyes betrayed him. Confusion showed on his face, and though he gave a reluctant nod, he said nothing. Words were useless against what Sol had just shown. Claire turned away, lips tight. Under the desk, her hands balled into fists, not from anger, but from refusing to admit the obvious. She'd been wrong. For a fleeting moment, her gaze shifted. Absolute arrogance was gone, replaced by a spark of doubt, not about Sol, but about the biases she'd held. For the first time in years, he didn't shrink into silence. He didn't just step out of the shadows for others to see. He stepped out for himself. That moment wasn't just a performance. It was a statement, a wordless but resounding declaration. Claire and Langston had wanted to make him a fool, but he'd silenced the room. No one expected the old janitor they'd long dismissed to carry a talent so stirring. The music room at Crestwood Academy still rang with applause as Solomon, Sol Turner, quietly left. His old shoes tapped softly on the wood floor, each step steady and sure. His breathing had calmed, but his heart still pounded, not from anxiety, but from something reawakened, pride, belief, and a voice he'd thought lost. He'd done what he never dared dream, stood before the class, used music to tell his life story, and made those who'd mocked him listen. Whether Claire Wentworth and Edward Langston admitted it or not, the truth was clear. They'd heard. The class had heard. Sol had never been the invisible man they'd assumed. As he pushed his trash cart down the hall, a warm voice called out, "Mr. Turner, wait a moment." He turned to see Margaret Hayes, an older teacher with silver hair tied back and sharp yet kind eyes. She approached, her stride steady, unhurried, as if she knew exactly what she'd say. Sol stood still, gripping the cart's handle, unsure of her intent. Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze piercing through him, not with disdain, but with certainty. "I heard you play in class just now," she said, her voice low but clear, "and I know you're no stranger to the keys. I heard you years ago, at Blue Moon Lounge in Atlanta. Remember?" Sol froze, memories rushing back like a gust. Blue Moon Lounge, where he'd been a star, where crowds clapped and Eleanor sat front row, smiling with pride. He looked at Margaret, searching his mind, then nodded slowly. "I didn't think anyone remembered," he whispered, his voice hoarse with surprise. Margaret nodded, as if expecting that. "I never forgot. You played jazz like it was your breath. And today, I saw it again. You gave up music, but it hasn't given up you, has it?" She paused, then added, her tone resolute, "Have you ever thought about teaching music to struggling kids? They need someone like you, someone who knows music isn't just notes, but a whole life." Margaret's offer struck Sol like lightning. Teach music. He'd never considered it. He'd abandoned the piano when Eleanor died, locked his talent in darkness, only playing in the chapel unseen. He looked at Margaret, his eyes clouding with mixed emotions. "I don't know," he said, hesitant. "I'm not that man anymore. It's been too long." But Margaret didn't waver. "You don't need to be that man," she replied. "You just need to be you, the one who just hushed a class. Think about it, Mr. Turner. This isn't a chance to reclaim the stage, but to give music new meaning." Sol didn't answer right away. He bowed his head, letting her words sink in. He thought of Eleanor, the nights he played in the chapel, Malik Jones' eyes when he heard him. Maybe she was right. Music hadn't left him, despite his efforts to flee it. But he wasn't ready, wasn't sure he deserved this shot. When he looked up, Margaret had walked off, leaving him with his thoughts. But the story didn't end there. In the hallway corner, Malik ran up, eyes blazing. "Mr. Sol, you were incredible," he said, voice brimming with excitement. "I knew you could do it. You inspired me. I want to learn music, play like you." Sol looked at him, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "You're young, Malik," he said. "Don't let anyone stop you." But inside, Malik's and Margaret's words planted a seed, a flicker of hope he wasn't ready to grasp. Meanwhile, Claire Wentworth couldn't shake what happened. As she left class with her posse, she tried to keep her usual haughtiness. "Probably just luck," she muttered to a friend, forcing calm. "He can't really be that good." But her eyes betrayed her unease. She'd wanted Sol to flop, to fumble so she could laugh louder. Instead, she'd been swept into his music, and that irked her more than anything. Langston said nothing as he left, but his steps were heavier, as if swallowing the truth that he'd misjudged Sol. Sol returned to work, pushing the cart down the hall, but his mind wasn't quiet anymore. Margaret's words echoed, "Teach music to struggling kids." He thought of the years he'd given up, the times he played in shadows, and that moment when the class clapped. Maybe he hadn't just proven it to them, but to himself. Could he take the next step? Could he let music back into his life, not just to play, but to pass it on? He stepped into his small apartment, as dusk painted the window gold. He set the broom in a corner, sat on the creaky old chair, and looked at Eleanor's photo on the table, her eyes as gentle as ever. The room was silent, but his mind wasn't still like before. What happened in the music room? Claire Wentworth's mocking laughs, Edward Langston's smug stare, and the roaring applause after round midnight, still rang in him. A soft knock broke his thoughts. He stood, opened the door, and saw Leroy Brooks, an old friend from Blue Moon Lounge, standing there with a familiar grin. Leroy, with white hair and a slight limp from age, still carried the optimism of a saxophonist who'd played alongside Sol. "Heard you tore it up at school today," Leroy said, his voice warm, stepping in and sitting down. Sol gave a rare shy smile, then began. "They wanted to humiliate me, Leroy," he said, voice rough. "Langston, the music teacher, called me up to play piano in front of the class. Claire, that rich girl, said I only knew brooms, but I played, like back then, and they went quiet, all of them." Leroy listened, eyes lighting up, as Sol described gliding over the keys, the class bursting into applause. "Told you, Sol," Leroy laughed, slapping his knee. "You can't hide from music forever. It's in your blood, like the sax is in mine." Sol bowed his head, hands clasped tight. "But it's been so long," he whispered. "I quit when Eleanor left. I didn't think I was worthy anymore." Leroy leaned in, serious. "You didn't quit, Sol. You paused, and today, you proved it. Don't let the past hold you back forever." Leroy's words blew through Sol's mind like a breeze. He stood, walked to the small, broken-keyed piano in the corner, the one he'd kept from Eleanor's days, but never played. He touched a key, dust coating his fingers, and pressed a note. The sound buzzed, imperfect, but enough to flood him with memories. He sat, played a few bars of Round Midnight, slow, halting. Then he stopped, eyes blurring, as tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. "I made them hear me, Ellie," he whispered to her photo, voice choked, "like I used to play for you." The tears weren't pain, but hope. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened. Leroy stood, resting a hand on Sol's shoulder. "Margaret, that teacher is right," he said. "You can do more than play in the dark. Teach the kids, Sol. Let your music live on in them." Sol wiped his tears, looked at Leroy, then the piano. He thought of Malik Jones, the poor kid whose eyes shone when he played. He thought of quiet chapel nights, when music kept him from breaking. And he thought of Eleanor. What would she want? She'd want him to go on, not just to play, but to pass on what life had taught him. "I'll try," Sol said, voice firmer than he expected. "Not to get back on stage, but to do something for the kids. Like Margaret said, give music new meaning." Leroy laughed, clapped his shoulder. "That's the Sol I know, but fix that piano first. It sounds like a stray cat." Sol chuckled, a rare, real sound, then nodded. He stood, grabbed an old toolbox from under the bed, and started dismantling the keys. Each screw he turned, each note he tested, was a step to fixing not just the piano, but himself. When Leroy left, Sol sat by the piano again, dim light on his face. He wasn't Crestwood's invisible janitor anymore. He'd proven it, not just to Claire, not just to Langston, but to himself. Margaret's offer wasn't a distant question, but a door he was ready to walk through. He thought of Eleanor, what she'd believed in him, and for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't just surviving. He'd teach music, let it live again, not for fame, but for kids like Malik, who needed it like he once had. When he rested his hands on the keys again, a note rang out, imperfect, but enough to start. Claire and Langston might not want to admit it, but they'd woken a part of Soul he'd thought dead. Now, he wouldn't let it sleep again. After that night, with Leroy Brooks, he'd fixed the small piano in his apartment, each key wiped clean of dust, each note tuned, no longer buzzing. He sat, played a few phrases, and for the first time in years, didn't stop from fear. Margaret Hayes' offer wasn't a far-off idea. It was the new path he'd chosen. Soul called Margaret, his voice rough but steady. "I'll teach the kids, if you think I can." Margaret laughed over the phone. "I know you can, Mr. Turner. We start next week." Soul's new journey wasn't easy. He stood before a group of struggling kids at a community center near Crestwood. Kids with curious but shy eyes, like he'd been as a boy. Malik Jones, the poor student from school, was the first to sign up. Soul taught them basic notes on the center's old piano, his hands trembling as he guided them, but his voice firm. "Music isn't for showing off," he told them. "It's how you speak when you've got no words." Malik listened intently, clumsy hands sliding over keys, but his smile glowed with each right note. Soul watched him, seeing himself in those eyes, a kid who once thought music was out of reach. In his spare time, Soul wrote a new piece. He called it Eleanor's Song, a gentle yet powerful jazz tune, a tribute to the wife who'd always believed in him. He played it on his little home piano, letting the notes tell their love story, his Blue Moon Lounge days, and the years he thought he'd lost everything. When Margaret heard it, she suggested, "Play it at the upcoming community concert. People need to hear your story." Soul hesitated, then nodded. He wasn't doing it for fame, for Eleanor, for Malik, for the kids who saw him as a teacher. Concert night arrived, the community center aglow, packed with Atlantans. Soul stepped onto the small stage, wearing an old but clean shirt, hands shaking as he sat at the piano. Malik stood beside him, holding a guitar he'd learned with Soul, beaming. When Eleanor's song began, the room hushed, then swelled with feeling. The melody spoke of pain, loss, but also hope and resilience. The crowd listened, some closing their eyes, letting it touch them. As the last note faded, the place erupted in applause, not just from the kids, but adults who'd never known Soul. In the back row, Claire Wentworth appeared, arms crossed, eyes cold as ever. She didn't clap, but she didn't leave. When Soul caught her gaze, their eyes met briefly. No apology, no admission, but something new in her blue eyes, a hint of regret she wouldn't voice. Edward Langston didn't show, but word of Soul's classroom performance had spread through school, shaking his reputation. Some teachers whispered Langston had been wrong to dismiss the old janitor, but Soul didn't care about them anymore. He'd risen above their mockery, not for revenge, but to reclaim himself. After the concert, Soul drove to the cemetery where Eleanor rested. He stood at her grave, night wind rustling his silver hair. "You were right, Ellie," he whispered. "I couldn't let anyone take my music. I made them here, and I'll keep going for you." He laid a small flower on her stone, peace spreading through him. He wasn't hiding anymore. Music was back, not just to play, but to inspire. Solomon Soul Turner's story mirrors issues still alive in modern U.S. society: prejudice over race, age, and class. Soul, a 68-year-old black janitor at Crestwood Academy, was mocked by Claire Wentworth and Edward Langston for his looks and lowly job, reflecting how many in America today are judged by appearance or background rather than true worth. When Soul played Round Midnight and stunned the class, he shattered that bias. Much like individuals in today's U.S., from street artists to everyday workers, fight to prove their talent despite doubt. His past racial rejection at Blue Moon Lounge recalls America's long history of inequity, still impacting opportunities for people of color in education or jobs. Soul's lesson isn't just persistence, it's daring to face the past and turn it into strength. He abandoned music after Eleanor's death, but when pushed, he chose to play rather than hide, a reminder that in modern American life, with pressures from social media, family expectations, or fierce competition, you must stand up, even when afraid. His choice to teach struggling kids with Margaret Hayes and perform Eleanor's song shows the value of using talent to lift a community, something vital in today's U.S., where unity and support are tested. Be like Soul. Don't let anyone define you by your job or age. Let your talent and actions speak. Thanks for joining Soul's inspiring journey. Hit subscribe to catch more stories of talent overcoming prejudice. See you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring people who dare to let their music ring out.